G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Matt McLachlan, owner of Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours, and he has joined us today to talk about the Battle of Pozières, where 23,000 casualties were sustained in just 6 weeks of fighting. Hi Matt, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks, mate. Great to be here.
Matt, I'd just like to basically start and get an overview of what Pozieres, like where it is, and what we were doing. What was the battle? What were we trying to achieve? And was it at success?
Okay, well, the Battle of Pozières took place in 1916, in July and August 1916, and the town of Pozieres, the village of Pozieres, is in the Somme region of northern France. So this is about an hour and a half north of Paris, and this was the region where the Battle of the Somme, the very famous Battle of the Somme, was taking place in 1916. So the Battle of the Somme started on the 1st of July, 1916, and Australian troops weren't involved in those opening stages of the Battle of the Somme. And the Battle of the Somme soon turned into this massive action, one of the biggest battles the world had ever seen. And the Australians were drawn in to assist with that battle later in July. The 23rd of July, the Australians joined the fight when they attacked at the Battle of Pozières at this little village. And the reason that Pozières was important is it wasn't really anything to do with the village. It was just simply the case that it was the highest point of the ridge on the Somme battlefield, known as Pozières Ridge. And so it was really important that the British captured this ridge. So to do that, they had to take the village of Pozieres. And I should say at this stage that after years of fighting, there was no village left to be captured. It was merely just a moonscape of craters where the village had once been. And so it was quite a task for the Aussies to come into the line on the 23rd of July and capture the ruins of the village and to take the German trenches nearby. So basically the Australians came into the line on 23rd of July and they fought there for about 6 weeks. And the battle was successful. They did succeed in capturing the village of Pozières and the surrounding area, but they lost 23,000 men killed or wounded in 6 weeks of fighting, which makes it the most deadly military action Australian troops have ever been involved in. So that's why we remember Pozières today.
If we read through the history and we see the blockhouse, Fort Gibraltar, and was there other objectives that weren't reached while we were in the 6 weeks of fighting?
Yeah, there were. I think like any action in the First World War, things changed as time went on. So that the main landmarks in the area were... So that there was, as I said, there was no village. In fact, the soldiers said that the only way they could tell where the village had been was because of the earth was slightly redder because of the dust from the bricks of where the village had been. So there was like a red hue on the ground showing where the village had formerly stood. But behind the village were two very large German trenches called OG1 and OG2, meaning standing for Old German 1 and 2. And behind that was a windmill, which had stood there for centuries. But by the time of the First World War, the early fighting had absolutely destroyed that windmill. So all that was left was a rough mound with some bricks and some concrete emplacements left on it. So those were the only landmarks on the battlefield. And immediately next to Pozières was a farm called Mouquet Farm, or known to the soldiers as Mouquet Farm or Mucky Farm, as the Australians called it. And Mouquet Farm was next to Pozières, and that was another one of the objectives that was set for the Australians. And so the fighting for Pozières and Mouquet Farm is, you can either look at it as one collective action, which is what we do when we say the 6 weeks of fighting, but they're actually quite distinct phases of the battle. So the attack on the village of Pozières and those trenches and the windmill, and then the attack on Mouquet Farm. And the Australians were not successful in capturing Mouquet Farm. They basically fought and edged their way forward until they were exhausted after 6 weeks of fighting, and then handed over to the Canadians, and the Canadians completed the capture of Mouquet Farm. But it was an extraordinary achievement, the taking of Pozières, but we remember it just for the sheer destruction of the Australian forces involved. So to lose 23,000 men in 6 weeks of fighting just shows you the level of intensity that was going on in that very small area.
That's a great overview. So how many of our divisions were involved in the battle?
There were 3 divisions. So the first division came in on the 23rd of July, and they only fought for 3 days. They only fought up until the 26th of July and lost 5,000 men in that time. So we remember the 1st Division as the famous division from Gallipoli. They came in and this was their first major action on the Western Front. They lost 5,000 men in only 3 days of fighting. They were then replaced by the 2nd Division, which came in. The 2nd Division had also served at Gallipoli. And the 2nd Division fought for another 10 days. So basically the 1st Division captured the village, or the ruins of the village, and then pushed on to the area beyond the village. And the 2nd Division then had an absolute slog for 10 days, basically from the edge of the village to these German trenches, the 2 German trenches I described, and the ruins of the windmill, which they succeeded in capturing by early August. And then they had lost nearly 7,000 men in those 10 days. So then they handed over to the 4th Division, who then came in and began the long slog along the ridge towards Mouquet Farm, and then lost thousands of men as well. And this cycle was repeated. When the 4th Division was worn out, they then brought the remnants of the 1st Division back in, and the 1st Division was replaced by the remnants of the 2nd Division, and then the 2nd Division was replaced again by the 4th Division. So it was just this giant mincing machine, just throwing men back into the machine and just edging forward inch by inch. Just some of the most grueling and horrific fighting of the war. And the 2nd Division was particularly... both the 1st and 2nd Divisions saw Pozieres as one of their key achievements of the war, which is why the 2 key memorials that are now at Pozieres, one of them is a memorial to the 1st Division, and the other one was originally a memorial to the 2nd Division, but now is more of an Australian memorial to all the Australian troops who fought there.
What you've just described, it sounds like an absolute slaughter, and just it sounds that it was, as you said, just a mincing machine. And it was there. Obviously, there was some heroic acts there. Do you know how many Victoria Crosses were won at Pozieres?
I'm trying to remember. I think 4. I want to say from memory, but that's straight off the top of my head from memory. But there were several Victoria Crosses that were won. Arthur Blackburn won a Victoria Cross. Private Cook won a Victoria Cross there. Martin O'Meara, I think, won a Victoria Cross. Claude Castleton won a Victoria Cross for rescuing wounded. I'm trying to think if there was any other Victoria Crosses, but there was the actions at Pozieres were just typified by bravery, heroics, just by the Australians achieving impossible things in these devastating odds. And the thing that's important to remember when we ask why was it so destructive is that this is late in July. The Battle of the Somme had been going since the first day of July. So 3 or 4 weeks later, the battle had actually started to die down in most other areas of the Somme. So the only real fighting that was occurring in that sector was at Pozieres. Therefore, every German artillery crew in the entire area, basically within range, was free to then turn their guns onto Pozieres. So what we remember about Pozieres is the Australians just sheltering in their trenches, or in the German trenches that they'd captured, and the Germans just raining artillery fire on them. And it was some of the heaviest artillery fire we saw during the First World War. So just horrific stories from the Australians, just about not being able to do anything except just crouching at the bottom of your trench as a hail of shells came in. Every couple of seconds, a high explosive shell would land. And that was the most horrific part of the battle. I remember one story about an officer was going down the trench and just checking on his men and just saying, "Come on, men, just hold your nerve under this hurricane of fire." And he came across a group of men who were playing cards. They'd gotten a box and they were sitting around the box and they were playing cards to try and steady their nerves. And the sergeant that was playing with them was killed by a shell blast, so they just threw his body up on the top of the trench, and another man sat down and took over his hand, and they just kept playing cards. So the officer remembered noting that. He went down the trench to check on the other end of the trench. He came back 10 or 20 minutes later, and all 4 men had been killed in a shell blast. So it's just this horrific rain of shell fire just on these poor blokes just huddled in the bottom of these trenches, and there was nothing they could do about it.
When you're describing that, the hair on my neck stands up. That is just... I now see why so many men were killed and why there were so many casualties. And so you hear of the British on the first day of the Somme, how they lost 60,000. You could say that really, apart from going away to Formidable, that this really was our sort of the same as the British. Our losses were terrible. Yeah,
it certainly was. I mean, this is the most costly battle Australia has ever fought in, from any war, not just the First World War, but from every war. This is the most costly battle Australia has ever fought in. And it's interesting that you mentioned Formidable, the other big action that Australia is known for from that period of 1916, July 1916. And Fromelles is known as the worst 24 hours in Australian military history, when we lost 5,500 men in that one battle a bit further to the north. And so what it means is that combined, the men that we lost, the nearly 30,000 men we lost, in those first two battles, is more than we lost in the Gallipoli campaign. So more men died in the first two battles on the Western Front than we lost in the entire 8 months at Gallipoli. So it's just extraordinary, just the level of death and destruction that went on the Western Front compared to what had happened at Gallipoli. I've actually got if you don't mind, I've got a quote here from one of the soldiers that was there, which might shed a little bit of light on what it was like to be at Pozières. So
absolutely, mate. Yeah, that'd be great.
So this is a quote from Second Lieutenant John Rawes from Melbourne, and he was in the 23rd Battalion, so in the 2nd Division. And this is his quote about what it was like to be at Pozières. All is buried and churned up again and buried again. The sad part is that one can see no end to this. If we live tonight, we have to go through tomorrow night, and next week, and next month. Poor wounded devils you meet on the stretchers are laughing with glee. One cannot blame them. They are getting out of here. We are lousy, stinking, ragged, unshaven, sleepless. I have one putty, a dead man's helmet, another dead man's gas protector, a dead man's bayonet. My tunic is rotten with other men's blood and partly spattered with a comrade's brains. So Rawes wrote that in early August from Pozières, and he was killed in the advance on Mouquet Farm on the 23rd of August. So he wrote that 2 weeks before he was killed himself.
Oh, I'm nearly shedding a tear listening to that. That is just, it's heartwarming, and you just hear that, Matt, and these men, absolute bravery, that what they did. I'm choking up. Harrowing stories like that makes, it really does. I can see why you study the First World War and why Pozieres is such a key battle that Australians do remember, and from stories that are just like that.
Yeah, it is really one of those battles that you can't help but be touched by. It's just the nature of the fighting at Pozières, and it's always been one of the actions that, I mean, the favourite is not the right word, but it's always been a battle that has really affected me emotionally. And one of the things I've noticed in my research is that Pozières was a real dividing line for the service of men in the Australian Imperial Force in the First World War. So what you tend to find is that there's two distinct groups of men in general: the men that fought up until Pozières, and then the men who fought after Pozières, because so many were killed and wounded at Pozières. There was really a dividing line in the service of the AIF. And I mean, you obviously see men who served from Gallipoli throughout the war. Obviously, there are exceptions, but I'm always amazed at how many people you see either served in that first group, served at Gallipoli, and then in the early battles on the Western Front, and then were killed or wounded at Pozières, and the group of men who then enlisted after Pozières and then fought on through 1917 and 1918. It's really quite extraordinary the effect this one battle had. Well, we had 3 divisions there, and half the men who fought there were killed or wounded in the fighting at Pozières. So you're talking, as we said, we're talking 23,000 out of probably 45,000 men who fought there were killed or wounded. So just extraordinary the effect that had on the Australians as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. So, of the survivors, if they were lucky to survive, Matt, what did they? Obviously, they went back in again, and after they had a bit of rest. And so, what came of the battle once the 6 weeks was over?
Well, it was pretty important. I mean, we handed over the Canadians, and they completed the capture of Mouquet Farm by the end of September. And it was pretty important in the sort of stepping stone of the Battle of the Somme, because it's hard to describe without looking at a map, but there's a long ridge, and at one end of the ridge is Pozieres, and at the other end of the ridge is a village called Thiepval. And Thiepval was absolutely crucial on the first day of the Somme fighting. The British expected to capture it in the early hours of the battle. As it was, it took them months and months and months. It took them 4 months to capture Thiepval, as it happened. And today, Thiepval, as the centre of some of the toughest fighting of that Somme battle, is where the great British memorial to the missing from the Somme is, the Thiepval Memorial, the huge red brick. Absolutely stunning memorial. So that's at Thiepval because Thiepval was so important. So if you imagine that Pozières is at one end of a ridge and Thiepval is at the other, the British, at the start of the Battle of the Somme, were trying to come up the ridge, just attacking Thiepval head on, and were absolutely wiped out trying that. So what they did is they changed tactics, and after the Australians and then the Canadians succeeded in capturing Pozières and Mouquet Farm, the British then used that as a stepping off point to then attack along the top of the ridge, which they were able to do. And then so by November, they had actually completed the capture of Thiepval and a number of other key points along that ridge. So, yes, it was very important to the outcome of the Battle of the Somme, and the Battle of the Somme was very important. But the amazing thing is when you walk this ground today or drive this ground, it's so tiny. It takes, to get the road from Pozieres to Thiepval would take 4, 5, 6 minutes to make that drive from the village of Pozieres to the Thiepval Memorial. And you're crossing land that took the British 4 months to capture and cost probably... literally hundreds of thousands of men were killed or wounded on both sides to just complete that short little advance. So, like so many things in the First World War, yes, it had a very valid purpose in the context of what they were trying to achieve during that war. But today, when we look back on it, you just think, at what cost to take these tiny little villages?
Yeah, exactly right. So, overall, of your opinion, was the historians claim that the Somme was a victory? Are you in that group as well, that you do say it is a victory?
Yeah, it's a controversial question. The Battle of the Somme went from the 1st of July until November, so it was basically 4 months of some pretty tough fighting. And it really depends which way you look at it. It certainly wasn't the victory the British wanted it to be. The British and French, we shouldn't forget the French, who also fought very strongly on the Battle of the Somme. The British and French thought this was going to be the battle that ended the First World War. After 2 years of fighting, they thought, this is it. This is the battle that's going to win it for us. And the plan was to bust through the German lines and to get cavalry in behind the Germans and to really roll up the German line and effectively destroy the German army in that part of the battlefield. Just on that subject as well, a lot of people dismiss the idea that cavalry would have been used in the Battle of the Somme, but that overlooks the fact that cavalry was really the only mobile force that was available. And so as long as machine guns and artillery were taken out of action by the infantry, the cavalry could have been very, very effective in that area, as they were in various parts of 1918. The cavalry did great work. So that was a little aside, but the plan to get the cavalry through a gap in the line and to ride up and down the German lines causing havoc was actually quite a good one. It's just that the infantry could not succeed at the task of breaking through the German lines. So in terms of what the Allies wanted to do, the British and French, no, the Somme did not achieve what they set out to do, and it became that very sinister phrase, a battle of attrition, which basically was invented because of the Somme fighting. The idea that instead of a big breakthrough, it would now be a battle of attrition, just grinding until you eventually wore your enemy down. But unfortunately, in this context, grinding means, thousands and thousands and thousands of men being killed every step of the way. I did some maths on it once, and I worked out that one man was killed or wounded for every inch of ground that was gained during the Battle of the Somme. So on a personal level, it doesn't bode well. But having said that, the way I look at the Battle of the Somme is that what the Somme absolutely did was demonstrated that the Germans would not win the First World War. If you have to say what was the point where the Germans accepted the fact that they were not going to win this war, in terms of they were not going to capture Paris, they were not going to conquer France like they did in the Second World War, what was the point where the Germans knew that they couldn't win this war? It was the Battle of the Somme. And so the Battle of the Somme really exhausted the Germans. It exhausted the French and British as well, but it also exhausted the Germans. And the Germans then, realising that they couldn't win the First World War in the way that they had wanted to, just basically went on the absolute defensive and were effectively then saying, well, we've captured this part of France. If you want us to leave, you have to kick us out. And so that then defined this process we saw for the next couple of years of war, where the Allies were always on the offensive, and not always, but mostly always on the offensive, and the Germans were then defending. So to that end, the Battle of the Somme was absolutely vital, because it marked the end of German ambitions to win the First World War. So I think it was a battle that absolutely had to be fought, and I think it was successful from the Allied point of view. So in that regard, yes, you could say it was a victory, but it's still quite controversial.
Yeah, absolutely. And from what you've just stated and said, that it's a cruel way to look at the Battle of the Somme, but the casualties and the death toll is justified.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not one that subscribes to the theory of the futility of the First World War. I think the First World War absolutely had to be fought, not just by the British and French and Russians, but by the Australians as well. We had very good reasons for participating in the First World War. And it's just the nature of that war. When you have a war where modern technology, the technology that they used in the First World War is the same technology we use today. Tanks, aircraft, machine guns, flamethrowers. the technology that was invented during the First World War is the same technology that we use today. And I've heard it said that in 1914, a soldier from the Battle of Waterloo would recognise the tactics and the way the armies were equipped in 1914. By 1918, a modern soldier would recognise what they were doing, because it was very much a war by 1918 of fire, movement, support, aircraft, tanks, all the things we associate with a modern battlefield. So when you take all that and put it in just such a compressed area, the area of the Western Front is absolutely tiny. And when you just put so many men, literally millions of men, tens of millions of men, in this tiny, tiny, tiny space with all this technology of destruction, the death toll is always going to be huge. And the Germans were incredibly well dug in, and they were not going anywhere. And apart from just sitting around waiting for them to die of old age, there was really no alternative except to launch attacks against them. And unfortunately, when you launch attacks against an entrenched enemy who is very well equipped with the latest technology, a lot of men are going to die. And so I'm not saying that mistakes weren't made during the First World War and during the Battle of the Somme. I'm not saying that mistakes weren't made. Of course they were. We hear this discussion about a learning curve, and that in elements that is true. But at the end of the day, there was no alternative to force the Germans out of France. To win a military victory against the Germans, you had to attack them, and to attack entrenched positions against machine guns with infantry is going to result in lots of men being killed or wounded. It's the sad reality of the First World War. It doesn't change the horror of it. I would never move away from that. It's absolutely horrific what we talk about. But if we talk about strategy and tactics, I mean, if you look at it, there was really no alternative except to attack and to try and defeat the Germans. And let's not forget, which we did. We did win this war. The Germans didn't die of old age and just pack up and go home. We soundly defeated the Germans 2 years after the Battle of the Somme took place. So, so it was a war, in my opinion, that was definitely worth fighting. And it was, the Battle of the Somme, as ghastly as it was, did achieve our aims in eventually defeating the Germans.
That's a great point that you make there. And so, do you?
It was a very long-winded answer to a short question, but that I think you know me well enough by now, mate, to know that that's kind of how I go.
Oh, mate, no, that for the listeners, that's terrific, because it actually paints a picture of, it tells the story of what the Somme battle was like. And I was gonna say, obviously there's a lot of criticism towards generals and during the First World War, and like the soldiers themselves, they were learning on the job as well, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. I mean, I think we overplay a little bit this idea of a learning curve. I think the injustice we do to the generals is this suggestion that they weren't aware of technology. That Haig didn't like machine guns, and that generals were the last people to recognise tanks, and as if it was the privates in the front line that were recognising it. I mean, that's ridiculous. The idea to implement new technology was coming from the top down. And generals are always assessing new technology and coming up with innovative ways that it could be used in an attack. So I think that the idea that we give the generals such a hard time during the war, and the chateau general who wouldn't leave the comfort of his chateau to come and see the troops, I think all that's quite ridiculous in a lot of ways. That there were good generals and there were terrible generals during the First World War, as there have been in every war. Some generals are great and some are terrible. But to tarnish them all by saying they were all terrible and cowards and wouldn't get into the front line is a little bit crazy. And I mean, you've heard me, Adam, talk before about the concept of the Chateau General and why I think that's all a bit ridiculous. But I think the generals get a hard time, and we should take another look at exactly what they achieved. At the end of the day, we won the First World War, and we won the First World War because of the leadership of the generals who made it happen. So.
Oh, absolutely, and like you've said, and like I've heard other historians say, generals didn't want to get their men. They didn't want to see them killed, because they've spent so much time training them that if that man was to die, then all that training they've got to start again with fresh troops. So the idea that a general, he just wanted to see as many of his division slaughtered I think it's absolute rubbish.
Well, it doesn't even make any sense. Like, why would anyone with a finite resource that they're in charge of doing, like you think about any person that goes off to do their job every day, you have resources that you need to get your job done. Why would you want to squander those? It doesn't even really pass the logic test. The reality of the situation is that generals, to be a good general, you have to be willing to face the fact that when you give orders, a lot of men are going to die. That's the same in every war. And you can't be a good general without just owning that fact that, you make decisions on the battlefield, men are going to die because of those decisions. So I think we have to create a distinction between the general who loved his men so much he couldn't bear the sight of them being killed. No general in any war thinks like that about his men. But having said that, they do know that their men are the only ingredient that they need to win the war, and so they're going to preserve them as best they can. I mean, I spoke to Dave Sabin, who was a lieutenant at Long Tan in Vietnam, and I spoke to him on my podcast last year, and it was interesting to hear the way he spoke about his men. So he was only a platoon commander, so he's only talking about 30 guys under his command compared to the hundreds of thousands that a general could have under their command. But it was still the same thing, that the way that officers look at their men. And he said that during the entire Battle of Long Tan, he was focused on how many rifles did he have in operation, because that was what was making his force effective, was how many men did he have to fire their rifles. And that was how he viewed. And I asked him the question. I said, when your men started to be killed and wounded, did you feel, emotional about that fact? And he said, well, absolutely not at the time. Every time I saw a man killed or wounded, I thought, okay, well, that's one less rifle I have to do the job that I've set out to do. He said after the battle, you started to feel those feelings of loss. But at the time, you are looking at them as a resource that you have to manage as well as you possibly can to complete your objective, which is to win that battle or to win the war. And every officer who has ever served thinks that way about the men under his command. So none of them want to squander the lives of those men, whether it's simply because they're a nice person and doesn't want to see people die, or probably more realistically that they don't want that resource to be weakened. Generals do not want their men to die. They want their men to succeed with the minimum number of casualties possible.
Mate, you've answered that brilliantly. Like that, it's exactly right. We've learnt that through history. And I should actually say to the listeners, the reason I chose Pozieres today to talk about is it's personal for me. I actually had two of my family members killed in Pozieres. One, my great uncle, he was killed on the first day at Pozieres. He was in the 2nd Battalion. And my other great uncle, my first great uncle, his cousin, he was killed on the 25th. And he was in the 27th Battalion. So that's essentially why I got Matt on to talk about the Battle of Pozières. And Matt, you and I've been lucky enough to go to Pozières with you, and you do feel, when you walk that battle, you do feel that you're walking with the ghosts, and it's special, isn't it? It's a real special battlefield to walk.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Even though it's small in terms of the number of men that were served there and were killed there, it's relatively large for a First World War battlefield. There's a lot of area to cover, and it's relatively unchanged from the war. I mean, it's obviously the destruction of the First World War is long gone. It's all farmers' fields now. The village is rebuilt. It's a pretty little village. But there's still enough there that you can walk in the footsteps of the Anzacs. And we did that, mate, when we went up the sunken road known as Dead Man's Road. We walked up to the village, which was pretty special, and found a grenade lying on the side of the road, left over from 1916. So you can still walk literally in the footsteps of these soldiers, and you can walk out across the fields. And I've always loved that about Pozieres, is that if you get there on a day when the farmer has cleared the fields and there's no crops in the fields, you can go out and walk across these battlefields, and you find so much stuff left over from the fighting, so many particularly chunks of high explosive shell, because there's just so much shell fire going on there. And, I found human bones when I've been walking across the fields at Pozières. I found a full leather ammo carrier that a soldier had, either lost or dropped during the fighting, badges, bullets, just incredible stuff that you just find out there, because there's just such an intensity of fighting in such a small area. So there is something quite emotional about walking that battlefield. And you're right, you do feel like you're walking with ghosts, and the memorials there are great. It's just it's a battlefield that just I can visit time and time again. It's absolutely fantastic. Just
on that point where you said the leather ammo, that's a very rare piece, because obviously, as you know, they changed after Pozières. They went away from the leather ammo pouches.
Yeah, it was really good. I was there in about 2003 or 2004, I think it was. And I was living in London at the time, and had just come over for the weekend to just go and spend some time. And I walked the entire battlefield, including the assembly area and the approach areas. So it was a great day in the rain and the mist and the fog. It was quite cold. But I remember I was walking around the site of where those trenches were. I described OG1 and OG2, And I was looking just for relics from the battle. I wasn't collecting them. I just wanted to walk and see if I could find anything left over from the battle. And as I said, I found some human bones, not a skeleton, but just isolated, like a leg bone and a finger bone and things like that you tend to find on the Battle of the Somme. It's pretty gruesome. And lots of shell shards and bits and pieces. I was finding quite a bit of stuff. And I said to myself, just lift your head up, Matt. You're standing here with your head down. You should be lifting your head up and looking around. And you should look around and soak in where you are. And so I lifted my head up. And as I just glanced around about 2 feet to my left, where I would have completely missed had I been just been walking with my head down, was this leather kit sticking out of the ground. And it had been run over by a tractor, so it was in pretty poor shape. But it still had a couple of rounds of ammunition left in one of the pouches. And as you said, it was leather. And you're quite right. What we know is that the Australians wore this leather gear. The gear that the Australians wore, or the gear that the British wore that the Australian stuff was based on, was made out of cloth webbing. But there was a shortage of cloth in Australia at the start of the war, so what we had a lot of was leather. So we made the same gear that the British were wearing, but we made our own version out of leather. And that was fine at Gallipoli, where it was dry and hot and warm, and the leather actually went pretty well. But when we got to France, so the guys who'd been in Gallipoli wearing this kit then brought it with them when they came to France. And it didn't work very well at all in France, in the cold and the wet and the damp. And it tended to shrink, and the size changed, and it warped, and it didn't work very well at all. So in pretty short order, they then switched to the British style of webbing. So it was pretty amazing to find that leather kit, which had only been worn at Fromelles and Pozieres, effectively on the Western Front, and to think that whoever wore that and lost it had potentially worn it at Gallipoli before he'd come over to Pozieres. And where I found it in the side of the German trenches meant that no one would have just taken it off and dumped it there casually just for the heck of it. He would have lost that because either he was killed or he was wounded, and so his mates took it off him as they were treating his wounds. So almost certainly the man that wore that did not have a very pleasant end during his time at Pozieres. Very emotional to have that. That was one thing. I don't normally keep things from the battlefield, but that was something I did take home with me, and I've still got it on my shelf at home.
It's a treasured piece in your collection, mate. And obviously, as I said, I've walked with you, and I know that you aren't a collector very much. So for you to have that, it's a very special piece.
Yeah, I tend, if I find something personal, I tend to take it with me because, firstly, these things don't last once they're exposed to the air. So, that bandolier would have been, destroyed the next time the farmer drove around in his tractor, or, with wind and rain, that would have been gone pretty quickly. And also, it's a personal connection to the blokes that were there. So, it's always, So occasionally, when I have picked up something from the battlefield, it's because there's some sort of personal connection with the soldier that carried it, which I think is really important.
Oh, absolutely. It brings the emotion into what you do as a job, mate. Absolutely. And was there many prisoners taken in Pozieres?
No, it wasn't a battle typically when you see lots of prisoners taken, it's because ground is lost. So you see an attack that either is unsuccessful, and so the attacking force is then repulsed and they leave men behind in the enemy positions, or there's a big action from the enemy which results in us losing our ground, and so then lots of men are taken prisoner. So we took a number of German prisoners during the time, capturing parts of the village. Not a large number, but some German prisoners were taken. But no, because of the nature of the fighting, it wasn't a battle where the Australians lost a lot of men taken prisoner. We tend to prisoners from the First World War on the Western Front tend to be associated, well, really with two very big actions were responsible for most of the prisoners taken on the Western Front. That was the Battle of Fromelles in July 1916, because exactly what I said, that the Australians captured the German positions but weren't able to hold them. So when the Germans then flooded back into their own trenches, they took lots of Aussies prisoner. And also the Battle of Bullecourt in 1917, because of exactly the same reason, the first Battle of Bullecourt in April 1917, for the same reason. That and I think the numbers, 1,100 men were captured at First Bullecourt, which was the most Australians taken in a single action until the fall of Singapore in the Second World War. So Aaron Pegram, who I think you're going to have on the show at some stage, has just written an amazing book about Australian prisoners captured on the Western Front. I think there's about 3,000 that Australians were captured during the course of the war on the Western Front. So quite a remarkable investigation into part of the story that we don't really know very well. And of course, those two battles, Fromelles and Bullecourt, were responsible for about 1,500 of those 3,000 men that were taken prisoner during the entire war. So it shows how disproportionate the number of prisoners were at those two battles.
Oh, absolutely. Was there a lot of trench raids, or was it just men going over the top and just pushing inch by inch and just trying to get OG1 and OG2?
Yeah, pretty much that. It was just slogging forward bit by bit. So artillery fire coming down, then the men attacking, holding whatever ground they can, digging into their new positions, and then launching the next attack from that spot. So raiding, as we talk about in the First World War, you tend to see in sectors where there's not fighting taking place at the time. So we tend to talk about raiding when there are two trenches facing each other with no man's land in between, and then there's no major attack going on at the time. So in order to find out who the enemy is opposite you, to take prisoners, to get intelligence, to assess what sort of defences the enemy has, the way you do that is by raiding those trenches, which is basically a very small, short attack, which is not designed to hold ground. It's designed just to get information, get prisoners, and get out of there again.
So virtually like the nursery sector when we came into the line on the Western Front.
Yeah, that's right. The start of 1916 was a time of a huge amount of raiding by the Australians to go and really give the Germans a hard time, keep them on their toes, get prisoners, get intelligence, assess what the defences were. So that early months, or sort of from sort of March, April, May 1916 was when we really think about raiding on a large scale. And then it got, of course, in 1918, the very Australian technique of raiding known as peaceful penetration, when the Australians carried out a lot of raids and actually snuck their line forward bit by bit by capturing small sections of the German line through well-organised raids. So, but no, that was not the nature of the fighting at Pozières. Pozières was send in thousands of men to slog their way forward, hand-to-hand combat, inch their way forward as much as they could, and then dig in wherever they ended that advance. And then the next group of men would come in and start from that position, and they would then inch their way forward. So that was very much the slog fest that was Pozières.
So do we, obviously with your studies, Matt, do we know the German divisions that were actually at Pozières? Do we actually have what units the Anzacs actually fought against?
Oh yeah, there's great research that's been done both by the Germans themselves and then scholars from the Allied side in later years. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but it's I mean, Charles Bean did great research into the German side of things when he wrote the official history. So at the end, always when you read the official history, an account of a battle that the Australians were involved in, the last several pages or the last chapter of any description of that action is the same action from the German perspective. And so Charles Bean did do quite a bit of research into the German activities, so it's listed in the official history what units faced us at Pozières. Although Charles Bean was limited in the records that he could get to, but in later years the Germans themselves released quite comprehensive histories, and then there's a number of scholars that have done great work, Jack Sheldon and a number of other scholars that have done great work into the German side of things as well. So yeah, we've got a fairly good understanding of what the Germans were up to at Pozières, and indeed all the battles on the Western Front.
Like you said, Charles Bean wrote in his official history that Pozières Ridge was more densely sown with Australian sacrifice than any other place on earth, 23,000, like you stated earlier on in the discussion. Do you agree with his statement? Because you've obviously walked that ground and you know that it's sacred ground. Do you agree with what he stated?
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, from a statistical point of view, it's very true that no other action has cost Australia as many men killed or wounded in such a short period of time. So even just from a statistical point of view, it's very true. But you also get that feeling from walking the ground. It is, there's a lot of big cemeteries in the area. There's a couple of very important memorials there. It's just so well known. I mean, have a look around Australia at the number of parks and streets in Australian towns and cities that are named after Pozières. It used to be quite common that houses, back in the 20s and 30s, if you built a new house, it was quite common to give it a name, and Pozières was a very common name for the house, either because it was a returned soldier who lived in that house and therefore wanted to remember the most ghastly battle he'd been through, or it was a family who lost someone at Pozières and so named the house Pozières to remember them. So, have a look, grab an old-fashioned street directory or type into Google Maps Pozières and have a look at the number of Pozières roads and Pozières avenues and Pozières streets that come up in towns all across Australia. It had a big effect. It's one of the 7 major battles that Australia fought during the First World War on the Western Front.
Well, it's like you said, Matt. It's if you speak of the First World War from an Australian point of view, most people remember Gallipoli, and we all know why. People know Gallipoli. Fromelles, Pozieres, and later on Villers-Bretonneux. And if you speak to most people, those are the main battles that they talk of.
Yeah, absolutely, and probably throwing in maybe Passchendaele in 1917. But yeah, these are the key. Well, these are remembered for a reason. They're the main ones that cost the most Australians. And what we should remember about the First World War, indeed any war that's really important, is big attacks were actually quite rare occurrences in a soldier's life. So if you find a soldier who served on the Western Front, for example, the number of big attacks he would have been in during the entire war is probably only 3 or 4. He could have done 2 or 3 years of service on the Western Front, and probably only participated in 3 or 4 really big actions. But of course, those actions were incredibly costly. Most of his daily life was digging trenches, going on raids, carrying food up from the back line, tedium, monotony, serving in the trenches and trying to stay alive under shell fire and not get hit by a sniper. So the majority of men that were killed either in a massive action like Pozières or Passchendaele or Villers-Bretonneux, or were just killed in the day-to-day mundane life of being in the trenches. So I read somewhere that the British, across the British line, they had a term which they referred to as wastage, and this was the number of men it took to hold a trench, to hold the British trenches when no attack was going on, and they put that figure at 5,000 men a day. So even just holding the trenches on the Western Front would cost you 5,000 men killed or wounded every day that you just held those trenches without even bothering to attack.
Mate, that figure. Like I knew it would have been high, but 5,000 a day. That's every day.
Every day for 3 years. Yeah, this was a savage war. Make no mistake, this was a savage war.
Absolutely, mate. I would have thought myself a few, maybe 2,000 men a day, but 5,000 men a day every day. That's why I guess for you and myself, we're so passionate about studying the First World War.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's battles like Pozières that give that clarity and give it focus, because you can go to that site and walk the ground where this action occurred. It's been very well documented, so you can trace very specific actions on very small parts of the battlefield, and that's really what I love about Pozières. There was a very complicated battle. There was a lot of steps involved, particularly that advance from Pozières to Mouquet Farm, trying to wade through the official history and understand exactly what was going on, because there were no landmarks on the battlefield, so they simply marked points on the map. So an advance would be ordered to take place from point 36 to point 41, which is simply 2 points on a map. And so to try and make sense of all of this, of where people were moving and what they were trying to do, and then to walk that ground today can be quite difficult. But all in all, Pozières is it's a remarkable battlefield that you can still walk the ground and walk in the footsteps of those Anzacs.
Absolutely. So if people want to visit Pozières today, what's left from the war and what can they see?
Yeah, it's pretty good. I mean, in my book, Walking with the Anzacs, I described quite a comprehensive itinerary around the battlefield, because there is a lot left over. But the two principal things that people want to see at Pozières, the two main memorials: the 1st Division Memorial, which is just on the edge of the village, and then on the other edge of the village, just outside, is the Windmill Memorial, as it's known, and that's the remains of that windmill I described in earlier in the interview, which has been preserved as a memorial. It was originally a memorial to the 2nd Division, but now it's generally an Australian memorial to all the Australians who fought at Pozières. So those are the two key memorials at Pozières that people want to see, and that they really do bring the whole battle into focus when you see those those two memorials. They're really quite moving.
So why was so obviously our national memorial was put at Villers-Bretonneux from our 1918 battle, and why wasn't our national memorial put at Pozières? Because that's where it cost us the most of our soldiers. Why, do you know the reason behind why the national memorial wasn't put at Pozières?
I think Villers-Bretonneux is a natural choice. Firstly, it was a very short action. It only took place over a couple of days. I mean, really, the one day, Anzac Day. The evening of Anzac Eve in 1918. It was a battle that materially, affected the outcome of the war in many ways. Villers-Bretonneux. So yeah, Pozières was a slog, a hard, difficult marathon of slogging forward. And yes, we achieved our objectives, but at the end of the day, it's debatable what the bigger picture was about that objective. So Villers-Bretonneux is very clear in what happened. The Australians were operating on their own at Villers-Bretonneux. They did a great job. In one day of fighting, which coincidentally was Anzac Day, they swept through and capture the village back from the Germans. So Villers-Bretonneux was a great victory. I mean, Villers-Bretonneux deserves its place as one of the most famous Australian actions and probably one of the greatest achievements of the war. Pozières, by comparison, is remembered for the hardship and the sacrifice and the destruction and the hanging on when anyone else would have given up. That's what we remember about Pozières. So I think it's quite right that, I'm sure they discussed it when they talked about where they were going to put our national memorial. But I certainly think there's a lot more glory at Villers-Bretonneux than there was at Pozières.
No, I tend to agree with that, and it's interesting that you brought up the windmill, and there was you and I have been there. There's now it's a this will probably be controversial, but I get really upset with what's happened at the windmill site. So I originally saw it for the private group bought the land behind the windmill and actually made a memorial to all the animals of the Great War, and I saw it before when it was farmland, and it was amazing. It was a beautiful. You looked out over the battlefield. You could see. You stood on the remains of where the windmill was, and it's now there's gardens, there's trees that will eventually grow up and block the view to Thiepval, the beautiful, and across the battlefield. And I'd like to get your thoughts on what you feel of the windmill site.
Yeah, you're right. It is going to be controversial, and anyone who's heard me talk about this knows that I am very outspoken against what's going on at Pozières. And just by way of explanation is, so as we said, the windmill memorial is in farm fields just outside the village, about a kilometre outside the village of Pozières. And it's always since, I think it was in the 1930s that veterans turned it into a memorial to the Australian forces. So this was a place where veterans could come and remember the Battle of Pozières. In addition, there's the 1st Division Memorial in the town. So there's two very important Australian memorials at Pozières, which is more than at most battlefields where Australians fought. And you're right, the idea for the Windmill Memorial was it was a relic from the battle that stood in the middle of farm fields. So you could stand on this site, stand on the mound of the windmill and look out across the whole battlefield. Basically what's happened is, let me start by saying that the people who are behind this are incredibly well-intentioned. There's no question their heart is in the right place. They are hugely dedicated to making sure that Pozières is not forgotten. And I absolutely commend them for that. And the people involved have done a lot of work over decades to make sure that, for example, students learn about Pozières in their classrooms and to raise money to help the village remember the battle, etc., etc. But it's gone a bit far. You have this private group now that have become zealous about Pozières at the exclusion of all other battlefields. And basically what happened is that, I think it all happened because of Fromelles. Everyone will recall that the mass grave that was found at Fromelles in the early 2000s, and then in 2010 they opened the cemetery at Fromelles and reinterred 250 bodies. Fromelles got a lot of attention at this time from 2005 onwards. Fromelles got an awful lot of attention. And I think that because of all that attention, the people who were big fans of Pozières and zealously loved the concept of the Battle of Pozières, I think they felt that that people had the wrong impression about 1916 and thought that the war was all just about Fromelles. So I think they got a bit protective of Pozières and the feeling that Fromelles was taking all the glory and no one knew enough about Pozières. So they switched from education programs at home in Australia to wanting to do something actually on the site of the Battle of Pozières. And what happened was then the farmer who owned the land next to the windmill then sold that land. It came up for sale. And so these Australian well-meaning private group purchased that land from the farmer. And they decided what they were going to do was build their own memorial park on the battlefield to remember the Battle of Pozières. And I think they're completely misguided. Even their website says, the forgotten Battle of Pozières. It's just ridiculous. Pozières is renowned as one of the most famous battles on the Western Front, if not the most famous battle on the Western Front. There's two massive memorials there. It's very, very well known. But for some reason, they got this idea in their head that everyone in Australia had forgotten about the Battle of Pozières. So their solution was they were going to build a memorial park themselves. They were going to fund it themselves and raise money, and they were going to build a memorial park so that Australians could come and remember the Battle of Pozières. As I said, very well-intentioned, but I think the execution is misguided and dangerous because, as far as I'm concerned, they are destroying the battlefield of Pozières because they are building what they call their memorial park, which let's be honest, it's very poorly done. It's not being done in conjunction with RSLs or architects or archaeologists. The RSLs have completely disowned them because of they're quite mad in some respects. No disrespect to them, but they're very obsessed with this idea of making sure Pozieres is remembered, and I'm just not a fan of the work they're doing there. I think they're destroying the battlefield. I think that Pozieres should be left as it is, as the veterans wanted it to be, which was standing on the windmill memorial and looking out over the farm fields. And looking out over the battlefields where all these men died. As it is now, as you say, they're putting in trees and benches and parks, and I think they're destroying the battlefield. And then they did one thing which has caused a lot of outrage, was another group of enthusiastic, yet, in my opinion, slightly misguided people decided that they were going to... they wanted to build a memorial to the animals who'd served in the war for some reason. Good on them, but... they needed somewhere to build this private memorial to animals. They couldn't find anywhere to do it. They knew that the people behind the Pozieres project had land. They went to them and said, can we build our memorial on your land at Pozieres? And the people who now own the land at Pozieres agreed to that. And they built a memorial which is quite amazingly disappointing in its amateurishness. It looks like a jumble sale. Again, I really don't want to sound disrespectful, but it is important that we remember why what we're trying to do in these battlefields. And they built a memorial which is... very amateurish, and it looks terrible. It's a collection of very poor sculptures. Some of them have been bought literally from garden centres, and they called it the Memorial to the Animals, and they put it right next to the Windmill Memorial at Pozieres. So now, behind this glorious Australian memorial that stood there as a testament to tens of thousands of men who died, and many of whom still remain in those fields, there's now this awful memorial to animals, which is completely out of place. The people behind the Pozieres project are now building this memorial park, which again is very poor in its execution and is building on top of the battlefield that they're supposed to be remembering. So, I know I'm very outspoken about this, but I just love them just to leave it alone. Just leave it alone. It doesn't need anything else. There's 2 wonderful memorials there. Men lie in these fields. These fields are a massive unmarked grave, and they're putting park benches and lawns and walls and memorials and planting trees, as you say, and I think they're just destroying the Pozieres battlefield. So, look, I'll get off my high horse now. I am very outspoken about it, but I would love them just to please stop. Just stop building private crap on the battlefield at Pozieres and leave it as it was intended to be. I'm very outspoken about it. I'm like the head of the anti-Pozieres Development Brigade, and so I'm probably not going to make many friends from this podcast, but there you go. But no, I just believe it's doing a disservice to the men that they claim to be respecting by building rubbish all over the tops of their graves in many cases. And so I'm very strongly opposed to private development of battlefields everywhere, not just at Pozieres, but Pozieres is probably the worst example of when people who are well-intentioned yet misguided in their activities can what they can do to a battlefield.
I agree with you, Matt. I had a hobby that's now turned into a passion, and I agree. I think it's the Pozieres. It's such a special place and a special battlefield, and I agree. I don't. There still is 2 great memorials that are there. Why do we need to add another memorial? And why pick Pozieres of all places where it's our most sacred battlefield of World War One? I agree, and mate, I know there's a lot of historians that support your views. I know that firsthand. I've spoken to a few. Well, Peter Smith, one of your tour guides who lives in Fleurs on the battlefields, and he's strongly opposed to it as well. And you could even bring in, if you want to, the soccer memorial of the 1914 where the Christmas truce, and that's another memorial that's just it's out of place on the battlefields.
It's not just an issue at Pozieres. It's an issue all across the battlefields that absolutely well-intentioned people, and I would never criticise their desire to remember these actions, but they're a little bit misguided that they feel that the best way to demonstrate is to build more stuff on the battlefields. And I'm the exact opposite. Let's stop developing battlefields. Let's just leave battlefields. I mean, the word is battlefield. Let's leave them as fields. It's not battle park. It's battlefield. Let's leave them as fields. The Aussies were there in the first place so that French farmers could be free to come back and farm the land that their fathers and grandfathers and for centuries they'd farmed. That was always the intention. The Aussies knew they'd done well when they saw French farmers returning to farm the land that were former battlefields. And that's an absolutely perfect intention of it was what their soldiers wanted. They built their memorials to their fallen comrades, and they built 2 beautiful memorials at Pozieres. Those memorials were built by veterans. They were built on the battlefield. The battlefield does not need anything else. And there's an argument that says, well, those fields were for sale and maybe they would have put housing development on them, etc. I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe that there was all of a sudden going to be a housing boom in Pozieres. But even if that was the case, even if they wanted to protect the land, fair enough, purchase the land, but then donate it to Commonwealth war graves or to Australian war graves so it could be preserved as an area. Lease it back to the farmer so that it's protected, but then the farmer can still use it for growing crops. Just don't build rubbish on the battlefield, and that's what it is. Unfortunately, I'm being very rude here, I know, but it's just rubbish. Anyone that sees the photos, and most people don't like it. There's a small group of people that think it's nice, but most people that see it feel that it's out of place. It's poorly done. It's very poorly executed, and it just is. I think it's just such a shame. It breaks my heart to see the history that you used to be able to connect with at Pozieres now completely covered up by amateurish building. But anyway, I've probably said enough about it. But my desire for the entire world is let's stop developing battlefields, leave them as natural as we possibly can. Whether that's governments wanting to build roads or wind farms or whatever it is, whether it's governments wanting to build official stuff or people wanting to put houses on them. I mean, I know time goes on. I know that we can't stop progress, but let's all strive as much as we can to preserve them as much as possible as the veterans themselves knew it.
Oh, absolutely. And you obviously we'll move on in a sec, but like you said, there's the official memorials that are on the Western Front are done very well. And we've got enough of them. We don't need any more. Like you said, we need to stop and just take the battlefields for what they are, which are battlefields, and they're in farmers' fields. So go and enjoy the battlefields as they were intended to be once the war came to an end.
And I think, there has been development that's happened since the war, obviously, and in the 90s in particular, Australia went on a bit of a frenzy of building memorials. But first, a couple of things about that. Firstly, it was officially sanctioned. It was sanctioned by the Australian government and funded by the Australian government. And it was done to recognise Australian battlefields that up to that point had probably not been adequately recognised. And the main one, for example, was Fromelles, where they built the Australian Memorial Park at Fromelles. But again, very sensitively, the beautiful Cobbers sculpture. They preserved the original bunkers that were on the site. They put in information panels so you could see what was going on. Also, the Australian National Park at Hamel, the Australian Memorial Park at Hamel, was another thing where they preserved trenches and built a large memorial to the Australians who'd fought at Hamel. They built a sculpture at Bullecourt and made a small park on the side of the German front line. But again, this was because these battlefields were not marked, that there were no memorials for visitors to come to, and these were officially sanctioned memorials that the Australian government designed, planned in conjunction with architects and with archaeologists and learned people who knew about protecting the battlefields, and designed them in a very sensitive way, and of course in consultation with the local French people as well, in a way that would preserve the memory of the Anzacs and enhance the experience of visitors. What's going on at Pozieres does not fit in with any of that. It's being done quite recklessly, I feel, by people who have great intentions but are just not executing it particularly well. Anyway, enough said. It's a bugbear of mine. I would go on about it for, we could do an entire podcast about how much I hate seeing development like that go on. But as I said, huge respect to them for how much they are in love with Pozieres and want people to remember. However, it's just the execution of that desire for remembrance that I think is actually destroying the battlefield that they claim to love.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That's right. I knew it would be a controversial question to bring up to you, and I knew it was a bugbear of yours, and I thought you can't have a discussion on Pozieres and not talk about. You can't get away from. You can't get away from it. It's just one of those things that has to be spoken about, and unfortunately, we are. There's, as you said, people love it. People like you and I, we've seen the battlefield for what it was before before they put the memorial in, and I must say I agree with you. I'm a fan of the way the battlefield used to be.
Yeah, well, let's see what happens in the future.
Absolutely. So just to sum up, Matt, do you, obviously there's been a lot of history that has, a lot of official records that have been written on Pozieres, and do you feel like that Australians back here, do you feel that they remember Pozieres and the men who fought in Pozieres?
I'm going to say I don't think they probably do well enough. And, by saying that, probably the people who are building all these memorials at Pozieres would then say, oh, okay, so we've got a point. What I think it is I think it's reflective of a lack of knowledge about the Western Front broadly. I don't think Australians know a lot about the Western Front. And if someone hasn't heard of Pozieres, they definitely haven't heard of Mont St Quentin or Menin Road or Polygon Wood or a myriad of other famous Australian battlefields. So, yeah, I think there could always be more knowledge about what went on the Western Front. But if people don't know about Pozieres, it's reflective of the fact that they don't know a lot about the Western Front in general. I think that Villers-Bretonneux obviously has a very well-deserved place in our national memory because of Anzac Day and the National Memorial being there. Fromelles has garnered a lot of attention in recent years. Again, quite rightly. You find 250 Australians buried in a mass grave and then identify 150 of them with DNA. That's deserving of being well known. So, so I think Fromelles does deserve its place. And yes, there's probably a limited capacity for people to understand exactly what went on the Western Front. So perhaps it does push battles like Pozieres to the side a little bit. But it's there for anyone that wants to know about it. There's, hundreds of thousands, millions of words have been written about Pozieres and its importance. There's the 2 wonderful memorials on the site. It's not a forgotten battle in any way, shape or form. And anyone that goes to the Western Front to walk in the footsteps of the Australians will find themselves at Pozieres as one of the first sites that they visit. So, look, I'm always pushing that we could learn more. It's the same about any campaign that the Australians have been involved in. We there's always more to learn. And I would love more people to know the name Pozieres off the top of their heads. But we've also got to be realistic too that, it was a long time ago. And it's, you and I, mate, as we said in our last interview, you and I are really preaching to the choir a little bit because for military enthusiasts, we do know the name Pozieres and we have a lot of respect. Less so in the general public, but, that's just kind of the way it is.
Well, maybe in the future, mate, it may grow, and because, obviously, like you said, the Western Front wasn't well known because people just learnt of Gallipoli, and obviously we've both been to Gallipoli, and we know how sacred and special Gallipoli is, and there's so much written on Gallipoli. But like you said, there's three more years of the war where the true Australian soldier was born on the Western Front.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. We lost 5 times as many men on the Western Front as we did at Gallipoli. And look, I don't think Pozieres is not any less known than it should be. It's not like there's other Western Front battles that dominate it. It's just it's in the mix of a bunch of Western Front battles that people don't really know that much about. And so, but that's why we're here. That's why we're doing this podcast today, mate, to educate people about it. It's a fantastic story, and and hopefully this encourages more people to go out and learn about it. So, it's a great story, and there's lots of information. It's certainly not, don't let anyone tell you it's a hidden battle. I have this argument, with people all the time about Fromelles, trying to convince people that Fromelles is not a forgotten battle, or at least it wasn't before the mass grave was discovered. But Pozieres, absolutely. I mean, there's no way anyone could construe Pozieres as a forgotten battle. It's one of the most well-known Australian actions on the Western Front. So it's hard to get away from.
Oh, absolutely. Well, mate, I think that's a good way to end the show, and I appreciate you coming on the show and giving up precious time and just giving the audience and telling them a little bit about the Battle of Pozières. So, mate,
mate, it's my pleasure. I never need an excuse to come and rabbit on about military history. So, thank you for the opportunity.
Nah, mate, that's fantastic. Thanks, Matt. And we'll definitely get you back on the show. There's some key battles that I would love to discuss with you in future podcasts. So, mate, thank you very much.
Sounds great, mate. I look forward to it. Thanks, Adam.